Welcome back, everybody, to Lab 3. Today we're going to be talking about research summaries and literature review. So for today's slides, first we're going to go over this project that I've been talking about a lot. What's the timeline on the assignments? We're then going to review how to conduct a research summary, which is going to be one of those assignments, as well as how to start a literature review, which is the next assignment after that. And then finally, we're going to do some more SPSS work. This time we're going to be running correlations, which is something that was talked about in our lecture this week. So to review the survey project timeline, you have already done one of these. That is that variable selection that is due, or maybe you've already done it. It's due Monday night at 11:59 p.m. It's the first lab assignment. If you haven't done it, make sure to go on and do it now. We also are going to be talking today about the research summary, which is due on the 3rd of February, and the literature review assignment, which is due 2 weeks after that on the 17th. As we go on in this semester, we're going to be talking more about the other 4 assignments that will be leading to your final paper, but you can kind of get a sense of the due dates right now. It's basically every couple weeks there's a new assignment. So what's the first assignment you did? This was the choosing variables of interest. You, again, should have done this already. You had 2 options to choose from. One was to have 2 continuous variables from that survey we filled out. For instance, you could choose sleep quality and depression. And when you are choosing these continuous variables, you should be thinking of it in the context of doing a correlation analysis. As a reminder from stats, a correlation is trying to see, does the variance in one continuous variable systematically relate to variance in the other continuous variable? This systematic is something I've talked a lot about in lectures, where you're seeing, are the changes in one related in some way that we can understand to the changes in others? Or is it just error? Are any different changes in one variable just kind of happenstance and there's other situations that are going on? So if there is a systematic relationship, we can say that they are correlated. Another way of talking about this that's a little bit more, easy to comprehend is, do the changes in one variable relate to changes in the other variable? And that's usually how we would write it up as an interpretation if we were writing our correlation. We don't generally use the words variance and systematic in our APA writing, so you'll put it in this other context, but you do want to theoretically know behind the scenes, a correlation is looking at that systematic variance relationship. All right, so you may have chosen those continuous variables, or you chose option 2, which is having one categorical variable and one continuous variable. For instance, you might have sleep quality and gear in school, where sleep quality is the continuous and gear in school is that categorical. If you are doing a categorical and continuous option 2, you will then be running a t-test instead. A t-test is looking at how variance in a continuous variable is systematically related to the levels of a categorical variable. Are the scores and the variance that's happening in one group different from the scores and variance that's happening in the other? Is there some kind of systematic difference between how people score on your continuous variable depending on which categorical variable they are in, which level of that categorical variable? So you chose one of these and you can mark that off. So what we're going to be talking about today as our next tasks are the research summary, which is to summarize one article that is related to one of the variables that you just selected. And then we're also going to talk already about the literature review. This is just to get it in your head so you kind of know what's coming. This is how to conduct a literature review on both of the subtopics that you have. So let's get started. Here is lab assignment number 2, your research article summary. The purpose of this project is to start practice locating and summarizing relevant journal articles. Now you have kind of done this with the proverb assignment, or you're doing it right now with the proverb assignment. So you're getting a sense of what's out there, how to kind of read through an article, but this is going to be your chance to apply it to the project that you're working on. And this will help you as you are moving on to that next lab assignment of the literature review, because the literature review is going to have multiple summaries that you're pulling together to do kind of a big picture summary, whereas this lab assignment, this research article summary, is only looking at a single article. So please read the directions for this article very closely. It is on Canvas. Some of the directions that people miss sometimes is that it does have to be one page only, and that's double spaced, not single spaced. Your normal 12-point font, do not try to cram it. This can be kind of challenging to fit everything you want to say onto a single page, but it is a good exercise for you to decide how you want to include the most important pieces of information. Talking very concisely and writing concisely is a very important part of being a behavioral researcher and being a scientist. It should also be in paragraph form. There are no bullets or subsections anywhere in this assignment. It is just paragraphs. That means it has the correct indentation on it as well. So last lab, we talked a lot about what we're looking for in articles when we are trying to summarize them, trying to understand them. You did get a little bit of practice reading through an article with a couple of those proverb assignments, turning an idea into a question and seeing what's been done to answer that question. But just as a reminder, you are going through these 4 sections of an article. You have the introduction, which is summarizing what is the researcher trying to say, and you should be summarizing what the purpose of the study, what is the researcher trying to do when you are writing your article summary. You also want to make sure you hit that hypothesis regarding what the researcher is trying to do. Yes, they have a subject, but how do they think those variables are related to each other? Not only how did they operationalize them, but why did they think that these operational outcomes would be connected? Why is there shared variance between the variables they're talking about? What do the researchers think they're going to find, and why do they expect that that would happen? Once you're done with the introduction, you can move on to the methods section. Again, there's some strategies for how you go through, whether you go through the introduction, then the discussion. But the methods section is telling you who the participants are and what the researchers did. Was it a survey that was conducted? Was it an observational study or an experimental study? There's a lot of details here that can help you to understand that operationalization of the variables and of the construct. You also have your results section, which is what did the researchers find? This is that interpretation of the statistics. So the very hard, what is the data? What was the actual empirical evidence they had that might support their or not support their hypothesis? And then finally, they have that discussion. What do these findings mean? So the second kind of interpretation and the evaluation, the going beyond the data to apply the findings to the real world and to understanding the theory that the writer is talking about. So what kind of conclusions did they draw, and why were those conclusions drawn? What is your take home from the article that you read? How can you summarize what they did and what they found and why it's important? So again, when you're reading, you can kind of go through introduction and then maybe the discussion after, skimming it. I talked a lot about sticking to those methods and results kind of after you really understand what they're doing, and then you can get just more details about it. So you don't have to necessarily go in this order, but all of these pieces should be included in some way in your article summary. You are trying to comprehensively show that you understand why they did it, how they did it, what they found, and why it was important. So here again are the details for your research article summary. Again, 1 page. We also have some resources that are available for you. So check out this Summarizing a Research Article resource, which is posted on Canvas. I'll make sure that it's linked to the page for week 3, so you can see kind of what information should I be looking for, get a little bit more detail on what I'm talking about here, and kind of make sure you're checking it as you go along. This assignment will be due on the 3rd by 11:59, so make sure you give yourself plenty of time to work on it so that you're not kind of caught in that last day or two frantically trying to find a good article and trying to understand it, especially if it happens that it's denser than you thought it was, or you're having a little bit more trouble understanding it. You want to give yourself time for this. And so that's what we are focusing on today during lab, is take some time to, instead of watching video, go find a good article and start writing it up, putting it together in this research article. But we do have some more today. That's not it. You can pause here and maybe go look at it, but we are going to also talk about your literature review. So this literature review isn't due yet, but I want to make sure that it's in your mind as an assignment that's coming up so that you can start thinking about why are you putting this research summary together and how might you be able to do that multiple times in an even more condensed version. A literature review is a summary and synthesis of all of the current work on a particular topic. So it's taking multiple research papers and summarizing them. Remember that one research paper is not a comprehensive piece of work. It is one way of understanding the the theory. It is one way of looking at the hypothesis to see if the hypothesis is supported to support your theory. And so we want to pull together a lot of different evidence and a lot of what other people have done to really understand our constructs and our theory and what we're trying to do in our paper. So we do need to conduct this literature review to know what has been done, and that will help us build a case for our hypothesis. Yes, in your Proverbs, you had one article that was maybe finding support for a hypothesis that you came up with, but you want to make sure you have lots of evidence so that your hypothesis makes a lot of sense to your audience. And you want to tell them what your hypothesis is, and you want to tell them why your hypothesis makes sense. Where did you come up with that hypothesis? But that can't make sense unless everybody has the background. So this is due in 3 weeks on the 17th by 11:59 p.m. This again, give yourselves plenty of time. Start finding articles early. Start taking notes. Pace yourself. Do not put this off until the last minute. So what you're going to need for your literature review is first a review of the previous studies. Most articles you're going to be reading have a lot of articles that they are going to be pulling together in this literature review, in this body of the introduction, talking about their ideas. But for you, we're only going to require 3. All right, this is a much reduced version of a full research article, but it's still going to be good for you to find these, and you want to dedicate about 1 paragraph per article. Now, if you want more in your literature review, that's fine. There just has to be a minimum of 3 articles. And you want to, again, stick with this idea that each article kind of deserves its own 1 paragraph summary. So you said, oh, it might be hard to fit 1 page of stuff for a research summary. Well, now you have to fit it all into a single paragraph. So here's where you have to be really concise. Make sure you're hitting the important parts of the research. And that's your TAs are going to help you with that as they grade through your research articles. And you can kind of look at the feedback they're giving you on what was the most important take-homes. So we're showing what work has already been done on this topic. Make sure that that's what comes across. For each article that you have, so each paragraph that you have in this literature review, you want to discuss the purpose of that study, what the hypotheses were that the researchers had, what was their general method, and what did they find? What was the interpretation and the conclusion? You want to explain how these different articles related or built upon each other. So it doesn't need to be this piecemeal, just here's an article, here's an article, here's an article, but why did you choose those 3 and how do they kind of inform each other? Were there similar theories that were linked together? Did they have different methods or similar ones? Did they have different findings? And you can work on kind of tying those 3 together to make a. As you are writing these 1 paragraphs kind of summaries of the literature review and how they relate to each other, make sure it's clear that you have both a conceptual and operational definition of your variable. You want the reader, the graders, to know exactly what variables the other researchers were using and why those matter. As I said already, make sure you note those methodological differences. Are they having conflicting results and how did they compare to each other? For instance, you might find that there is one study that was looking at the relationship between perfectionism and depression and found that they were significantly correlated, but another that didn't. And maybe you could note that, oh, the one that did find the relationship was using the CESD questionnaire, whereas the one that used the PHQ-9 was not. So perfectionism and depression were significantly correlated in a study using the CESD questionnaire to measure depression. However, a similar study used the PHQ-9 questionnaire to measure depression and found no relationship with perfectionism. That is an interesting point. And then you could elaborate on what might be different here between those 2 questionnaires. Why did that matter? Why would there be different outcomes there? You need to make sure that you are keeping concise, so don't include every detail of the prior studies. Make sure to include those main findings and results. Don't kind of add in everything just because it's there and it feels like it needs to go in. You have to be very focused on what variables are of interest, what information is of interest, and what is not. What analyses really stood out and helped to inform the point that you are making in your literature review that will lead to your hypothesis, not necessarily everything that was done. Make sure the methodological issues you are bringing up are also only the ones related to your variables of interest. A lot of times you're going to read research that is talking about your variable from a lot of different perspectives, or maybe it's incorporating details about other variables that are related to your variable. Well, you don't need those. Right? If you're trying to do on perfectionism and depression, and you read another article about perfectionism related to sleep quality, well, you don't really need to talk about the sleep quality portion of that, because you only really care about the perfectionism variable that's there. And why is that important? Now, one thing that does happen a lot in first-time literature reviews is that it does feel like just section pasted on section pasted on section. One paragraph is a standalone summary of an article, and then article 2, here's why that's interesting, and then article 3, here's why that's interesting. So I want to reiterate that you want to link these together. Find those comparisons and contrastings. You're finding the apples and oranges, and how do they relate to each other? You can compare these things in some way. Do they have similar methods? Do they have similar samples? And if they don't, what's interesting about that? And maybe there's nothing interesting, in which case don't bring it up. Only bring up what you think might be interesting to help the reader kind of build towards your hypothesis, and why do they need to know about this research article. You can also use good transitions to link together. The similarly and however and in addition, make it flow. You are writing an argument about why these pieces of information are interesting. So don't just kind of rote 1, 2, 3, wham, bam, bam. Tie it together. So as you start this literature review project, we have a couple of things that should help. First, you have your research summary. So that is one article that you've already written a one-page review about, that then you can look at it, condense it into kind of one point, and then you're reiterating it. So you'll have a little bit of practice already. But you also want to think through what you expect to find in the literature already. You know the variables. You've chosen 2 variables that I'm guessing you're at least a little bit interested in and have an idea of how they might be related to each other. So what is your hypothesis about how they are linked together? What do you expect to discover as you are looking through the research about it? And that can help you to kind of target and go down paths. You also want to make sure that your keywords are more productive than not. You want to think of those synonyms and antonyms. You want to boil down from a general topic like relationships and well-being into something more specific. So depression or social support mechanisms while waiting uncertain periods. You also don't have to focus on just the combination of variables that you have. You could start looking at how one of your variables is related to something else. So again, if you are trying to study perfectionism and depression, maybe you could look up articles with perfectionism as a keyword and depression as a keyword. But you could also just look up perfectionism or perfectionism related to other things that might be related to depression. You don't necessarily want to talk about all those other variables in your summary, but you might get some information about one of your variables more than you would if you only looked at them in the combination of your variables. This process of searching for literature is going to be an iterative one. So you'll start out in PsycInfo using keywords related to your variables, but you want to try different kinds of searches, different combinations of your synonyms and antonyms. Use different ands and ors, as you saw in Lab 2. You can also try different search engines like PubMed and Google Scholar, because they might have different access to different articles. They might have different algorithms for how they present the articles based on those keywords. And then you want to, as you go, change your keywords. Help develop your topic. You're going to be learning as you go about what are some words that you see that are coming up a lot, or what came up in one article that you really liked that you didn't see in others, but you want to focus on that specific keyword or that term. And then as you're going, you might have come in with a hypothesis, but that might be changing a little bit as you skim over articles and see what other people have found. Maybe you'll be introduced to a completely novel way of understanding the relationship between those 2 variables. So once you've found a promising group of articles, make sure to keep them together. Note them somewhere. I mentioned last time one of the worst things that can happen to a researcher is to find a bunch of good articles and then forget to note them down, and so you have to come back and do all this research over again. But make sure that they are all journal articles, empirical psych journal articles, peer-reviewed. No meta-analyses, no dissertations, no review papers, and definitely no newspaper or magazine publications. Once you've found that big set of articles that you think are interesting, go ahead and just choose the 3 best. Again, you can include more than 3 in your literature review if you really want to, and definitely in your introduction, which is the next one that you're going to have, you can do more than that. So actually, let me reframe that. Your literature review should only be 3, but in your introduction, hold on to those articles so that you can maybe include more if you want to. But for your literature review, choose the best 3. Your literature review assignment will have 4 parts to it that will be graded on. First, you need to clearly state what your 2 variables are. It should be no question to the reader about what you are studying. You then give this brief summary of the 3 articles, again sticking to 3, forget what I just said about maybe more, just stick to 3, and have the brief 1-paragraph summary per. And once you've kind of created why the links between these articles and why they are interesting, you can then move on to stating your hypothesis and how do the articles that you just told us about relate to your hypothesis? How do they support what you think is going to be the relationship between your variables? You also need to make sure that you have correct APA references. All 3 of them need to be written correctly. So if you're still unclear about how to write an APA correctly, talk to your TAs, look on Purdue OWL, look at your APA book, whatever you need to do. Find out how, because that's going to be a graded part of it. This literature review is a 2-page maximum for this assignment. That's not including the references page. So I said for the research summary, that is a 1-page review. This time it is a 2-page review. And the references will be that 3rd page, which is always a separate page from it. Now be very careful on plagiarism. We talked last week about how to do APA style, specifically about avoiding quoting and what is a summary versus just kind of stating what exactly has come from the other article. So summarize things in your own words. It should be your kind of take home, not exactly what was said by the article or by the original researcher. All right, that's enough about literature reviews and summaries. Now, on to SPSS, my favorite part of every lab. So if you need to pause, a little bit of an activity here with SPSS, go get some water, stretch, do whatever you need to, and then come back and open that SPSS data file _psych 317 again. By now, hopefully all of you have access to SPSS and are no longer having troubles with loading it through app2go or with IT, or if you know how to find it in the library. So go open this file and then you can continue on. So what we're going to talk about today is how to run a bivariate correlation. We talked in lecture about what a correlation is, how to interpret those positive versus negative correlations, or a 0 correlation where there's no systematic variance that's relating between the variables. So here is how to actually run one. And next week, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about how to run t-tests. So running a bivariate correlation between 2 continuous variables, you're going to go into SPSS and click Analyze, Correlate, and Bivariate. Once you're in there, you are going to select the 2 continuous variables you want. Now, this won't work for non-continuous variables. Any correlation that you get, if it lets you, won't really be interpretable. So it needs to make sure that there are continuous variables loaded in. So for this activity, we are going to choose age and conscientiousness as our 2 continuous variables. So go ahead and move those over the same way you would have done with your descriptives or frequencies. Just kind of click that middle arrow, slide them over. And in this bivariate correlations window, you also want to make sure that 3 things are checked. The first is that Pearson correlation coefficient is selected. You also want to make sure you're using two-tailed test of significance. That's just whether you're looking at relationship in a single direction or either direction. There can be any relationship between it. Two-tailed is the relationship can be either negative or positive. And then you want to ensure that flag significant correlations is selected. This is just a way to help you out as you are reading your output. Once you have those 3 things checked and you've moved over your variables, just go ahead and click OK. In your output table, you now will open up and see this correlation table, and it should only have 2 variables in it because you did this bivariate with 2 options. Now you could include more variables, and this table could get bigger and bigger, and what it shows is every pairwise correlation between the variables you've selected. So it's going to show you how age is related to conscientiousness and how conscientiousness is related to age. It'll also show you how age is related to age and how conscientiousness is related to conscientiousness. You see how it's a grid where down the middle axis, down the diagonal, are all of the variables related to themselves. But then off the diagonal, we have those comparisons, those pairwise correlations. And there's 3 pieces of data that you're looking at in the table for each kind of cell between the pairwise comparisons. The first is your Pearson R coefficient, or just R is how it's talked about. And this describes the strength and the direction of the correlation. Remember, the strength can range from -1 to 1, with 0 being no relationship at all, -1 or 1 being a very strong, extremely strong relationship. And then the direction is either negative or positive. So here we have a positive R because it's not negative. We also are going to have the p-value. You should remember from statistics that we conduct null hypothesis significance testing, which is testing what is the likelihood of the outcome, assuming that there was nothing interesting to found, assuming that the null hypothesis existed. So we're looking for a small p-value to indicate that it is significant. Specifically, most often we're looking for p is less than 0.05. Now this can change. Some people are looking for less than 0.01, some people are looking for less than 0.001, but in general, we can learn the 0.05 is a good enough significance to mark something as significant. Again, it has to be less than that 0.05 to be significant. In a correlation table, because we did that flag correlations as significant, that check mark that you put in the window, now we're going to see an asterisk next to the R value if it was significant. So here we have a 0.023, which is less than 0.05. So that 0.219 R value is flagged with the asterisk for significant correlation. We then have our N value. This is the number of participants whose data was used for the analysis. Participants are only used in the analysis if they had data from both variables. If there's a participant who filled out one of the variables, maybe indicated their age, but didn't answer the conscientiousness variable, they would not be included in your sample, or sorry, in this analysis. Same way the other, if they included conscientiousness but not age, well, we can't find a relationship between their values because they didn't give us both values. We can't see changes in variance because they didn't indicate where they were on the variance spectrum. Oh, and I wanted to make sure that it's clear, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but the information in one side of that diagonal down the center is the same as the information on the other side. Just like age is related to conscientiousness, the row of age to the column of conscientiousness, the same data is there for the row of conscientiousness and the column of age. They're exactly the same. They always will be, never different. I don't know how it would be possible, but if there is ever a situation where you see it different, you must have done something not right and go back and check your stuff. But I don't even think it's possible. Just look at the interpretation. Just look at how they're the same. All right, but we do need to interpret this information, so we need to do a write-up. You do need to include the strength and the direction in every kind of write-up you do about a correlation. First, is it weak, medium, strong? And there's kind of an accepted strength indicator based on the number. So generally we say that anything that's 0 to 0.2 is very weak, 0.2 to 4 is weak, 4 to 6 is moderate, 0.6 to 8 is strong, and greater than 0.8 is very strong. Now this table I have of R values, this is absolute value, so this is just the positive end, but it could also be the negative end, the negative direction, where there's a negative relationship. So a negative 0.2 would be very weak or weak. A negative 0.7 would be a strong negative relationship. Now I say strength and direction because it's very important to have, but only if it is significant. If the p is less than 0.05, then that means there actually isn't any relationship. It can't be strong. There's no such thing as a very strong non-relationship. It's either there is a relationship and it's strong and negative, or weak and positive, or there is no significant relationship, which you can just say, we found no significant relationship between these variables. You then include an interpretation. What does the correlation mean in terms of the data? So put some context to it. And then you include the statistical values that are taken from your analysis. So for this specific example of age and conscientiousness, we could say, we found a weak positive relationship between age and conscientiousness, such that older participants also indicated more conscientiousness than younger participants. So as one increased, the other increased, and very specific, as age increased, conscientiousness also increased. That's the interpretation. And then we have the statistical values. This is for a correlation always indicated with an R, because that's the statistical indicator. And then in parentheses, you include the N, which in this case was 107, and it equals the R value, which here was 0.219. You then have a comma, and you include the P value. P should be italicized because it is a statistical operator, and then P equals 0.023. Now, a lot of times you'll see people say round to the second decimal, just 2 decimal places. I didn't in this example, just so you could see the correlations. And we're not going to be super strict on that, but in general, you should do 2 decimal places with your write-ups. All right, well, that's it. Obviously, I'm going to ask you in your checkpoint to do some SPSS, so get that ready. And also, you should start working on that review summary, the research summary, as well as starting to collect articles for your lit review. This is relatively short, only a 30-minute lab, so use all of the extra time that you would have had listening to me with finding those articles. That is your assignment and activity for lab today. And then next week, we'll start talking about how to write an introduction section, which is that next step beyond the literature review. All right, have a great day.